in persons of declaration shall not be refundable. But ours is not a case of a refundable. We are asking whether we can get a credit of that 45 lakhs rupees if 100% of undisclosed income is assessed to tax under the Income Tax Act. An identical provision under VDS 197, there were two provisions, section 67 subsection 2, which is similar to 187(3), and section 70, which is similar to section 191. The only 2-3 words more harsh in section 70 if you read, any amount of tax paid in persons of declaration made under subsection 1 of 64 shall not be refundable under any circumstances. And if I go back to 191 says shall not be refundable. So under the VDS 1997 there were 3 more words, under any circumstances no refund. We don't find those words under 191 of the present Act. In spite of the words being under any circumstances, Supreme Court and various high courts have consistently taken the view that no tax can be levied or collected without the authority of law, even if the declaration has failed. If the tax amount, to the extent he has paid, department cannot retain that amount and he should get the credit for it under the normal assessment. Judgment of Supreme Court, various high court consistently taken that view, in spite of those harsh verdicts in the VDS scheme under any circumstances. IDS we don't find that word, so I don't find any difficulty in claiming credit for the 45 lakhs which we pay under the normal circumstances if you do not apply the theory of proportionality and charge the 100% tax under the income declaration scheme. That takes us to case study 4. Unanimously, all the groups have given a very simple answer. I need not waste much of everybody's time on this. The offshoot of dilution of 80 formula and removal of the exemption under 1034. Till the time dividend was exempt from tax, 14A though it applied to all the exempt income, it still applies to all the exempt income, but 99% of the times, the moment 14A comes, what comes in our mind is dividend. So once dividend has been taxable, now 14A does not apply to dividend and therefore dividend chargeable. And if it is chargeable, you claim deductions against those dividend income. Subsection 1 of section 56, which is a general provision, and subsection 2, which says that without prejudice to the generality of the provision, following shall be chargeable to income tax under the head income from other sources. And if you read various clauses of subsection 2, only the very first clause, dividends, stops at the word dividend. If you read further, interest on securities, it will say if not chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or profession. If you read further, rental income, if not chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or profession or income from house property. But dividend, the very first clause, it stops at the word dividend. So irrespective of whether you were carrying on a business of dealing into share, whether the dividend was on shares which were your stock in trade or whether it was your investment, dividend by default chargeable under the head income from other sources. Now section 57 is the section which gives deductions from income which is chargeable under the head income from other sources. Two clauses may be relevant. First one, in the case of dividend or interest on securities, sum paid by way of commission or remuneration to a banker or any other person for the purpose of realizing such dividend or interest on behalf of the assessor. To my mind, totally ridiculous in today's era, because those were the days when dividend used to come in physical form, everything. There might be some charges for realization of that. Now everything in the the electronic mode, I don't think any banker is charging anything for just realizing the amount of dividend. But clause 1 says against the dividend income you will get this deduction. Even under 57, you will find that various clauses deal with some particular type of income, and against that particular type of income, what amount of deduction you will get. But there is a general provision under clause 3 which doesn't talk about any type of income. It simply talks about expenditure. So any other expenditure, not being in the nature of capital expenditure, so similar to 37, laid out or expended wholly and exclusively for the purpose of making or earning such income. So when we are talking about expenses against the dividend income, more so about interest income, interest expenditure, it may not fall under clause 1, but it may fall under clause 3. Any other expenditure laid out or expended wholly and exclusively for the purpose of making or earning such income. Now when dividend made taxable, they said now 14A cannot be applied to dividend. Therefore they inserted a proviso in section 57. The relevant part of the proviso, that no deduction shall be allowed from the dividend income. So no deduction shall be allowed from the dividend income. That is the first part of the proviso. That means dividend taxable on gross basis, as far as the first part of the proviso is concerned. However, later on it says other than. So there is some exception to this. Other than deduction on account of interest expense. So against the dividend income you can only claim interest expense, no other deduction. That too subject to a caveat that it shall not exceed 20% of the dividend income. That means 80% of the dividend minimum you have to pay tax. Your interest expenditure could be less than 20%, then it is fine. So if it is 15%, 85% of the dividend would be chargeable. But if your interest expenditure is higher, say 25% of the dividend, it will be capped to 20%. Minimum on 80% of the dividend you have to pay the tax. Now the question arises in the facts of the case. The company was into the business of trading in shares and securities. So shares are forming stock in trade. Profit from this activity of dealing into shares doesn't fall under 56. It is chargeable under section 28 as business income. But because of the typical wording of section 56(2) clause 1, dividend always taxable under income from other sources, and long back we have a Supreme Court decision to that effect also, that even if you are dealing in shares and securities, dividend would not be taxable under section 28, it would be taxable under section 56, and therefore the chargeability of this dividend income would fall under 56. However, if I am dealing only into shares and securities, my whole activity is that my business is dealing into shares and securities, then the income which I am getting from dealing into shares and securities, whatever profit I am earning from dealing into those shares and securities, that is chargeable under section 28. So that leads us to an absurd situation. Some part of income is taxable under 56. Major part of income is taxable under 28. Now where do I claim the deduction? Do I claim the deduction under the head profits and gains of business or profession, or do I claim deduction under section 57? In my view, unanimously everybody has agreed that because of the typical wording of section 56(2)(1), dividend is chargeable under this head. However, it still retains the character of business income, and in fact for the purpose of set-off of loss there are decisions to that extent that where the brought forward business loss can be adjusted only against business income. Even those business support that dividend income, though chargeable under the head income from other sources, for the purpose of set-off of loss, it will be considered as arising out of business income, and therefore brought forward loss can be adjusted against the current year's dividend income. And therefore, I claim the entire deduction only under chapter 4D dealing with income from profits and gains of business or profession. Now what is section 57 and what is the proviso? 57 is a section which gives that deductions. If I go back to section 57, income chargeable under the head income from other sources shall be computed after making the following deductions. And clause number 3, any other expenditure laid out or expended wholly and exclusively for the purpose of making or earning such income. Can we say that the interest expenditure which I am earning, where my activity is into dealing into shares and securities, is wholly and exclusively for the purpose of making or earning dividend income? Certainly no. And the moment I say that this interest expenditure is not wholly and exclusively for the purpose of earning dividend income, 57.3 itself doesn't apply. So I am not claiming any deduction under 57.3. So what will be the effect of the proviso? We say that no reduction shall be allowed from dividend income. I have cited various decisions in this presentation. So what is the effect of the proviso? Proviso generally acts as an exception. It is added to an enactment to qualify or create an exception to what is there in the main enactment, and ordinarily a proviso is not interpreted as stating a general rule. So you cannot start reading with the proviso, you have to start whether you are in the general rule. If you fall in the general rule, then you see in the proviso whether you are taken out. And as a teacher, one of the favorite pastime of teachers is to remove certain students out of the classroom. Dharan was my student, but he was a very intelligent student. Many times he did not attend my classes also. Dharan, where are you, by the way? So one fine day I went to the classroom. Dharan, as usual, sitting on the last bench, the usual place. That day he was not there in the classroom. Somebody in the last bench made some noise, and I said, Dharan, get out of the class. What an absurd statement. All the friends said, Dharan तो क्लास में आया ही नहीं, आप निकालोगे कैसे? उसने आपको निकाल रखा है. तो मैं किसको निकाल सकता हूँ क्लास से? क्वेश्चन फॉर मी. आई कैन टेक ओनली दैट स्टूडेंट आउट ऑफ द क्लासरूम जो आया है क्लास के अंदर. एंड दैट इज द इफेक्ट ऑफ द प्रोवाइजो. इफ आई क्लेम समथिंग अंडर 57.3, you can take it out by virtue of the proviso. I am not claiming anything under 57.3. Where comes the question of taking me out by virtue of the proviso? I am carrying on the activity of share trading. I am claiming all the expenses under the business income. So I am not claiming any deduction under 57.3. Proviso should not at all apply to me. And the wordings of 57.3 itself support my case, because 57.3 says only if that expenditure is wholly and exclusively for the purpose of earning or making an income. So when I take a loan, I buy the shares, my whole activity, my focus is to earn out of selling those shares. Incidentally, by the time I am holding it, the record date comes, I get some dividend. But that was never my intention to earn the dividend income. So I had not taken that loan, I had not spent that money wholly or exclusively for the purpose of making or earning dividend income. I am not claiming any deduction under 57.3, and therefore there is no question of applying the proviso and making the disallowance. For the purpose of 14A, various decisions to that extent. One paragraph I extracted from Maxop, which also supports this view that when shares and securities are stock in trade, if you are dealing into that, dividend is an incidental income. It may be chargeable under that income from other sources. That time, of course, the dispute was not there, but they say it retains the character of a business income. But then one question needs to be answered. Then what is the effect of that proviso? Proviso apply कब करना है? See, my simple understanding, proviso is to be applied only in a situation where shares are not held as stock in trade. If you are holding the shares as investment, the dividend income is chargeable under income from other sources. If at all you are claiming any deduction, only place to claim the deduction is 57.3, and therefore the proviso would apply. But where shares are stock in trade, 57.3 doesn't apply, and therefore the proviso. Now coming to case study 3. The whole idea of this case study 3 was in fact not to discuss in which year the capital gain would arise. Since ages, we have been struggling with this concept of development agreements and redevelopment agreements. When will the transfer take place? Whether part performance of a contract, 53 of the Transfer of Property Act, 247 definition of transfer, clause 5, clause 6, transaction, enabling the enjoyment of whole property, etc., etc. But generally in the cities like Mumbai, where redevelopment takes place of residential complexes, we are least bothered when do you say the transfer takes place, because we have a shelter of 54. If I have a residential property, whether you say transfer takes place the moment redevelopment agreement takes place, but the builder is giving me another house, so I get an exemption under 54. Even if you say the transfer doesn't take place in this year, transfer will take place when the completion of the building takes place, whether by virtue of 45(5)(a) or by applying various case laws, SSI, or sometimes by an intelligence drafting that the possession which has been handed over is only a license to enter into the premises, and therefore it's not illegal possession, and therefore 53(a) doesn't apply, 247(y) doesn't apply, and therefore no transfer takes place in the year of redevelopment. All those things as far as residential is concerned doesn't make much difference because of 54. But what happens to a commercial property redevelopment when there is no 54? How do you adjust in the block of assets? So the whole idea of the case study was whether 43(6) is dependent upon chargeability under 45(1) or 45(5)(a), or it is independent of that. So we have the concept of block of asset. This concept though originating from section 32, but when it goes to the chapter 4E of the Income Tax Act, under the capital gain portion, section 50 is a special provision for computation of capital gain in case of depreciable asset. Few of the groups were also debating whether 45(5)(a) would prevail over 50 or whether 50 would prevail over 45(5)(a). In my humble understanding, the question itself should not arise, because 50 is not a chargeable provision, it is only a machinery provision as to how to apply section 48 for the purpose of a depreciable asset which is formed a part of a block of asset. The chargeability would fall under some of the section of section 45, some of the subsection of section 45, whether it is 45(1) or whether it is 45(5). But once one of the charging section applies, how to compute capital gain, that is provided in section 48. 48 says, from the full value of consideration you take these three reduction: expenditure on transfer, cost of acquisition, cost of improvement. Proviso says if it's a long term asset, you index the cost of acquisition, cost of improvement. See, if there is a block of asset I am stuck, where is the cost of acquisition, where is the cost of improvement, how do I index? And therefore 50 says, if the subject matter of transfer is a asset which is part of a block of asset, if you read the opening part of 50, it says 48 and 49 shall stand modified to the following extent. So the 50's role is only limited. Then how to apply 48 for the purpose of block of asset, that is section 50. So first of all you will have to decide what is the chargeability, whether it is 45(1) or whether it is 45(5)(a). But before that, depreciation is computed on the block of asset, on the WDV of the block of asset. Block of asset definition we all are aware. Most important part is section 43(6) C2. I have given in the form of a formula how to determine WDV, opening WDV of the block. What you have to add is the actual cost of asset falling within that block acquired during the previous year. Now section 32 says depreciation is allowed on block of asset used for the purpose of business. And this wording used, so much of litigation as to what is the meaning of the word use. And as a teacher I always wonder, even today I am wondering, as a tax professional हम लोग इस रूम में बैठ के हम लोग डिसाइड कर रहे हैं use, and those fortunate and happy people on earth who don't know income tax, कि बाहर जितने भी लोग घूम रहे होंगे इवन इन दिस होटल, नहीं क्या 350 लोग मिलकर डिसाइड कर रहे हैं यूज क्या होता है। हम बताते व्हाट इज द मीनिंग ऑफ यूज। पूरे हिंदुस्तान से यहाँ जमा होकर बोल रहे व्हाट इज द मीनिंग ऑफ यूज। Anyways, so we have the theory of active use, passive use, put to use, etc., etc. And unanimously all the decision says that you will get depreciation only if the asset is put to use. If you do not put the asset to use, you don't get depreciation. And 32 also says you will get depreciation at the prescribed percentage on the written down value, which is defined under section 43(6). Which says that actual cost of asset falling within that block acquired during the previous year is to be added. If you read this, because 43(6) is only a definition section, how to determine WDV? But the first question is why to determine WDV, and why to determine WDV is to claim depreciation, and the condition for claiming depreciation is the asset should be put to use. And therefore, something should be added in this 43(6) only once the asset is put to use. If you purchase an asset and don't put to use, that asset is not eligible for depreciation. And since 1988, because we have the block concept, you don't get depreciation on individual asset. You have only one WDV of the entire block. And because you get depreciation only if the asset is put to use, that would indirectly mean in this formula you will add the actual cost of asset only when you put it to use. If you don't put that asset, if you purchase an asset in year 1, but you put it to use in year 2, you can add it in the WDV only in the year 2. Because if you add it in year 1, just by applying the mathematical formula here, that actual cost of asset acquired during the year, because 43(6) doesn't say used. 43(6) simply says acquired during the previous year. So you may say in year 1 I have acquired, but the moment you add it, you get one consolidated figure of WDV. And 32 says depreciation at the prescribed percentage of WDV, then you will be claiming depreciation on that WDV, and for one block you cannot have a bifurcated aggregated 2 WDVs, one block will have only 1 WDV. And therefore the rational interpretation would be that you add something in this formula only when the asset is put to use. Till the time the asset is not put to use, simply because you acquired the asset, you do not add it. Then what is to be subtracted from the block is a very interesting thing. What you subtract from the block is monies payable in respect of any asset within that block which is sold, discarded, demolished or destroyed during the year. So you have the opening WDV, whatever asset you purchase, if you put to use, actual cost of those assets you add to the block, and if any of the 4 events occur during the year, then you subtract something from the block. So what do you subtract? Monies payable. And the first time I introduced this term to monies payable to the student, we simply say selling price. Asset बेचा, selling price minus कर. सर मैंने बेचा तो पैसा मिलेगा ना, ये तो 11th standard से दिख रहे हैं, receivable. Why is it money is payable? Somewhere it is that money is payable to me. I am selling to you. I have to receive. You have to pay. So what is the money you have to pay to me? That is money is payable. But when do I subtract this money is payable? When the asset is either sold, discarded, demolished or destroyed during the year. To make the life of tax professional little difficult, very cleverly, intentionally or unintentionally, legislature in its own wisdom, as if it's a natural human being, did not use the word transfer in section 43(6). But the moment you enter the next chapter, chapter 4E of the Income Tax Act, all charging section will say transfer of the asset. And transfer is a very wide term. Section 2 clause 47 defines transfer in inclusive manner. Transfer includes sale, exchange, relinquishment of an asset, extinguishment of right therein, blah 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 blah. Sale is one of the facets of transfer. And then in the context of capital gain, we have those dispute whether destruction would amount to a transfer. Supreme Court in Vanya Sale Mill, etc., etc. Then 45 1A subsequently to take care of insurance. But my limited point in the case study is when the redevelopment agreement takes place in the year 1819, assessment year 1920, whether any of these four events had taken place: sale, discarded, demolished, or destroyed. If no, nothing is to be subtracted. If yes, it is to be subtracted. Money is payable in respect of any asset within that block which is sold, discarded, demolished, or destroyed. Four events, one consequence. Either of the four events, sold, discarded, demolished, destroyed. Consequence, money is payable because of that. Now anybody would wonder then, if I sell, money is payable to me, I understand. If I discard it, I demolish it or destroy it, who is going to pay money to me that I subtract? Money is payable. So the section further says that money is payable and sold shall have the same meaning as provided in explanation below 41.4. Now we have nothing to do with 41.4, but only for the limited purpose of definition of money is payable and sold. These are the two expressions which are used in 43.6. The explanation to 43.6 takes us to the explanation below 41.4. So you don't find the definition of money is payable and sold in 43.6, but you will find under 41.4, and these are the two definitions. Money is payable in respect of any building, machinery, plant or furniture includes, and one very interesting discussion in one of the group, it's an inclusive definition because the word is includes, and there are two limbs in this. First part is insurance, salvage or compensation money is payable in respect thereof. Second part starts with where the building, machinery, plant or furniture is sold, the price for which it is sold. Is this definition really inclusive? A includes B. We generally say it's an inclusive definition of A. A means B. We say it's a perfect definition of the term A. A could not have any other meaning than B. But if anything goes by straight-jacket formula, then it is not a tax law. And therefore, to my limited understanding and reading, even if the term is used, includes, in some context, it can be an exhaustive definition. I don't know what was the context of 41.4. Long back that 41.4 is now not operative for us. But 43.6 takes me to 41.4 and therefore I have to do this. Now I have to read this money is payable only for my purpose of computing WDP for the purpose of section 43.6. And 43.6 ties my hands that you have to subtract money is payable only in four situations: sale, discard, demolishing, destruction. If a fifth event takes place, that event itself is not visualized in 43.6. When the event itself is not visualized, no question of any subtraction. And there is no question of subtraction. Where is the question of finding out how much is the amount of subtraction? So out of the four events, if money is payable in the context of 43.6 is to be used only in four events: sale, discarding, demolition or destruction. The first part says insurance. If I sell, will I get insurance? No. And in fact the second limb says where the building, machinery, plant or furniture is sold. So out of the four events, first event is taken care of by the second limb, where you sell it. So if you sell it, what is money is payable? The price for which it is sold. So now three events remains. If I sell it, second limb of money is payable. If I don't sell it, what are the remaining three assets? Discarding, demolishing or destroying. Second limb fails. It takes me to the first limb. First limb says insurance, salvage or compensation monies. So if some destruction takes place, you have a policy, the insurance money. If you scrap it, discarded, demolished, then whatever salvage or compensation you get, that is the money payable. If that is the impact of money payable for the purpose of 43.6, even though the opening word says includes, I would say it's an exhaustive definition because my hands are tied. I have to use this definition only in 4 events: sale, discarded, demolished or destroyed, not on any 5th event. Then even the term sold is defined.